Hello and welcome back to the Simplifiers podcast, where we take topics in business and in life and simplify them. Now, friends, when you get a chance to be a podcaster and talk to the various people that you've met over the lifetime of your career, that is, I think, one of the very best bits of being a podcaster. And this is one of those moments today. So my special guest today is Thom Singer, and he is probably one of the first people I know in my network and circle who went out and said, you know what, I'm going to start a podcast. So let's talk about building influence through podcasting. So Thom Singer is a motivational keynote speaker, and he's a professional master of ceremonies. He speaks to business audiences around the U.S. and beyond. I've seen him on stage. He is dynamic. He's authored 12 books, no small thing to sneeze at, and he's also the host of the popular podcast called Cool Things Entrepreneurs Do. I'd like to welcome to the Simplifiers podcast today, Thom Singer. Hey, Thom.
Hi, Mary. Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Oh my gosh. So Thom, hello. At the time of this recording and when this is released, you will have released 450 episodes. I mean, my goodness, when did you start as a podcaster?
So I would have loved to have started a little earlier. I started sort of at the beginning of the hockey stick. 4.5 years ago,
Yep.
I actually launched the show on September 30th, 2014. And the day I launched my show is the same day Gary Vaynerchuk launched his show, which was sort of the beginning of all the celebrities launching shows. So I wish I had started 2 years before everybody sort of got in on it, but it has been a great journey.
Oh, but that is what we all say about everything, right? Like, oh, I wish I got into it when I really had that hunch, when I really felt like this is the thing, right? And then we wait 6 months and then it's like, oh, crap, everybody's doing this thing. But this is such a great chance to interview you because 450 episodes, I believe, I mean, who is it? Malcolm Gladwell, he says, you know, to master something, you have to do it 10,000 hours logged in. I think you've hit the 10,000 hour mark, I'm sure. So where I want to dive into your brain, Thom, is if you could break down your top 5 lessons learned through the journey so far, and let's talk about and simplify how you've been able to build influence through podcasting.
So the first lesson I learned is if you want to do something, start. You can overthink things to death. And so, you know, I literally didn't really know a lot about podcasting. I'd only been listening to podcasts for about a year, and something told me I needed to do this. I like people. I like to interview. I use my voice and speaking as part of my living. Mm-hmm. And so I did. I jumped in and did it. I wasn't sure if it was going to be something I was going to last. The reason I got into it was I saw a speaker say that if you ever feel like you're in a rut in your career, the best thing that you can do is go interview 50 experts. Now, his suggestion was interview them to write an article, and at the time I was a pretty active blogger.
Yep.
And so I thought, I will interview 50 people. I'll write 50 articles on my blog from this, and then I will learn something. So I went into it thinking this was a 50 episode adventure. And now, almost 5 years later, I'm still going. And the only way I could have gotten to here was to jump in and do it. So that's the first tip I would give. Do you want me just to go through sort of 5?
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more because I think that is so true. I've been in business myself for 16 years now. I have a sweet 16-year-old now. And I can look back on the journey of running the Simplifiers and go, all of those big milestone moments where everybody goes, wow, you made it look so easy, Mary. It's because I took 10,000 bazillion steps before that, right? And I think there is some truth to not feeling like you have to have everything perfect. You have to have all the equipment perfect and you have to have all this stuff. You just gotta start, right?
Yeah, I mean, without question, if you were to go back and look at episodes 1 through maybe 100, they're nowhere near as good as these episodes that I'm doing in the 400s. And I imagine it will continue to get better. But I learned this in my speaking career.
Yeah.
Early on in my speaking career, I read an article in Speaker Magazine. Now, I always joke that is proof that there is a magazine for everybody.
Right.
But in the article, there was a lady named Roxanne Emmerich. She's a legend in the speaker business. And she said, before you're ever going to get good, she goes, I don't care who you are, before you're ever going to be good, I mean, truly good, you have to do 300 speeches.
That's it.
So her thing was get out there and give speeches. And I found this to be true with the podcast as well.
Yeah. And I mean, again, with repetition, anything that's scary becomes like second nature to you. I mean, I think that's it. You know, the first time I went scuba diving, terrified, right? I scuba dive a lot more now, and I love it. It's a freeing sense. And I think that translates to podcasting as well. So tell us tip number 2.
So I think tip number 2 is figure out your cadence and your, God, I'm blanking on the word I'm thinking of. Figure out your cadence and your format. So for me, I started by doing a fully interview show. And I figured out I was going to do it twice a week. Now, the reason I did twice a week is I couldn't afford to pay my editor 3 days a week. So I could only do 2. But the more content you put out, the more likely you're going to get found. So I see a lot of people who do what I call occasional podcasts. Get all gung-ho, and the first 5 or 6 they do once a week or twice a week or whatever their cadence is going to be. And then after about, I don't know, a couple months, they're like, oh, welcome to the show. Yeah, I know it's been a while. Now, maybe they have very loyal audiences who love them and get up and all this stuff and can't wait, and they'll check in every day to see if there's a show. The people who listen to my show, if my show disappears, they go on to something else. I don't have that type of an audience. So you have to have a plan for how often you're going to do it, and then you have to stick to it. There's a saying out there called pod fade, and that is that most podcasts fade away after like 7 to 12 episodes.
Oh, no, I heard that stat recently. The current stat on Apple Podcasts and iTunes is that 50% of the podcasts that are out there stop after 10 episodes. 50% of what's out there. And I bet, Tom, having been through this now a year with my own podcast, it's because those people go in, holy cow, this is a lot of work. I don't know if I could do all this, right? Like they just don't even realize how much work goes into the behind the scenes of what we're doing.
Well, I think it's a lot of work. And I think the other problem is that they don't realize that they're not going to get famous right away.
Yeah.
So they release 10 episodes and they're not getting that many downloads, and the Today Show hasn't had them on, and whatever their business is hasn't tripled, and they're like, well, this is stupid. Which will lead me to my third point, which is longevity is the magic.
Yeah.
So it's to have a successful podcast and build any type of brand or complement the brand that you have, you absolutely, without question, have to realize that this is a long tail, long-term play. I'm in my 4th year, and only now am I starting to see real benefits from the show. I'm starting to see real compliments from the show. My listenership, I was in early enough where I was able to capture a lot of listeners early, and I held that. I get about 1,000 downloads in the first week, and then several thousand over the life of the episode for years.
That's great.
But that's not 10,000. So it's not a huge show. But most shows, I think Grandma and about 6 people are listening.
Yeah, well, I'm a big fan of the 1,000 True Fans concept. What was it? Kevin Kelly from Wired magazine, he wrote that article. It's like, the idea of needing to be mega huge and have 1 million followers, that's all well and good. And that happens to like 0.1% of the content creators that are out there in the world, the Gary V's and the Jenna Kutchers and all of that. But, as a business, all you really need is 1,000 true fans, people that are going to shout from the rooftops about you and purchase your products and services.
Well, and I think we have a bad habit in our world, in our society, if you will, and that is that we focus on the outliers. So we look at the people who have these runaway shows, these people who are getting, 1 million downloads per episode, and we say, I want to be like them. And we skip the fact that there's 1 million steps in between. Or that we don't have what they have. I'm always amazed how many people get so into like the NPR shows and the numbers that they get. Well, they have the brand of NPR behind them. You don't. So it's not the same. It's not apples to apples for the celebrities or the people who come from big brands who have shows. So for me, it's really about I'm doing this for the long haul, and I'm finding like recently my show went into partnership. 1 episode, I do 8 a month. 1 episode a month is in partnership with the Austin Technology Council. So I interview someone who they would like to have interviewed, and then they promote the show as if it was their own podcast.
Yeah.
And another podcaster came to me and who lives in Austin, and he has a business show, and it's sort of one of those occasional shows. And he said, you are so lucky that they came to you for that. And I said, well, first of all, we kind of came up with the idea together. And second of all, it really wasn't luck. They looked at the fact that I had done over 400 episodes and that my show always comes out on time. Yeah. And they realized that this was a legit thing that they could partner with. So to say it was lucky was sort of an insult. This was a long-term play. And now I'm getting the extra publicity and the extra listeners from them.
Yeah. And, I think that points back to your point number 2 of cadence and format. I mean, I am a big believer in this too. I think you have to run a podcast like a business. And the formatting of it, if your episodes like ours come out every Tuesday and Friday morning, we do that strategically because we know our listeners are doing the morning commute, or they're on the train, or they're doing the school run, or whatever it might be. And so we want to be that cornerstone that is always there when their schedule is all up in the air. So yeah, I mean, I think that's huge. And then by showing that consistency and really playing that into the long tail strategy, really it's a marketing strategy, right? The podcast is a marketing tool for you to spread the word of who you are. Yeah, that's where I think the secret is. You can't just create an episode and magically hope that people are going to listen. There is a whole other element of that. And I think that's genius for you of just thinking about those collaborations, partnerships locally, other people that are going to help promote that episode beyond your scope of what you're possible to do.
Yeah. And I have to say that had I quit after 10 episodes, I would not be reaping the rewards that I have today.
Totally. Yeah, totally. And so given that, I think sometimes when you start into a new project, you don't know what you don't know, right? So what would you give as advice to somebody who's thinking about starting their own podcast and they're like, well, I don't know. Can I? Do I want to do this after 10 episodes? What would you suggest to them at the pre-launch phase?
Either be committed or don't be committed.
Yeah.
It's sort of like writing a book. When I wrote my first book, had I just said, I'm going to write a book, we would never have any books. But I had an editor who held me accountable, and she expected pages every week. She'd call my wife if I didn't have the pages in at that time. And so I had a program. I had to write so much every single week.
Yep.
And I had someone holding me accountable. Well, the same thing is true. I actually missed an episode. I put it out late, but I missed an episode back around the time that we recorded this episode of your show. Mm-hmm. I got emails from people saying, you're my Tuesday drive time. Mm-hmm. There was your Tuesday show is my Wednesday drive time.
Yep.
And there was no show.
Yeah.
And so, I realized that while I don't have a billion listeners, people expect it because people are creatures of habit.
Yeah.
So be committed to do it or don't do it. I mean, another strategy you could use is to go and be guests on other people's podcasts. And therefore, you could use their platform to promote yourself.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I know you and I spoke earlier about this off the camera here. It's like, setting yourself that goal of like, right, how about if I am a guest on 100 different podcasts this year? Just make that a goal. Rather than launching your own, if that seems too big and scary, then set yourself a goal of being a special guest, an expert on other people's. Repetition. That's the bottom line. Just do it over and over again. Yeah. So keep on telling me more about longevity. So when you said that the longevity is where you're starting to reap the benefits in the 400th episode, what kind of benefits are you seeing?
Well, first of all, I'm getting people who are referring me to speak at their conference. They listen to the show, or their husband listens to the show, and I talk about who I am and what I do. The show is called Cool Things Entrepreneurs Do. But when I interview somebody or when I do a solo episode, I use my own business as an example.
Yep.
And so people who listen to the show have an understanding of who I am and what I do. And so people are referring me to opportunities that are coming, straight from the show. Now, it's not a lot. I'm not saying, I'm making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year directly from the show. But if I'm getting 1 or 2 extra possible leads a year and I'm closing half of that, that's legitimate money.
Yeah. Well, and that I think is the magic of podcasting that I love, love, love so much in doing it myself is this is a chance for people to really build that know, like, and trust. And they hear your voice. I mean, you are with them when they are working out on the treadmill. You are with them when they're walking the dog. You're with them in the rush hour traffic, right? And you don't realize that that has a compound effect over weeks and weeks and months of hearing Thom's voice and, you know, hearing your stories and hearing your blunders and all the things that builds such a relationship behind the scenes that you don't even know is happening. So the point where they actually reach out to you, it's been working months in advance.
When you bring up a really interesting point, and that's that people do business with people they know, like, and trust. The problem is the definition of the word know, K-N-O-W, has changed drastically in the last decade in our society because of all this mobile and digital and social media. So now people all assume they know everyone because they follow them on Twitter.
Yep.
They listen to their podcast. But the thing about the podcast over a blog or Twitter or some of these other things is you do get to hear them, which takes you from, it's really not knowing me because you listen to my podcast, but because it's my voice and they can hear my ideas and I go off on tangents, you can get a little closer to like and trust. Now, what I teach people is when you can personally grow a relationship with people and get to real like and trust.
Yeah.
That's where the magic happens in today's business because it's so much more rare.
Well, and I listen to your podcast and I know what's true is that you're not scripted. You're not, you ask smart questions. You ask the questions that I would want to ask if I was interviewing that person. So, and those are, in my opinion, the very best podcasts, the ones where it feels like a genuine peek behind the curtain and having a conversation with two experts. That's where I think differentiates you. And so I think that brings us to point number 4 about differentiating yourself. Tell me more.
Well, point number 4 would really be, to me, is about pivot. So point number 4 is, as your show goes on, if you feel you need to change it up, be willing to change it up. And so that does tie in sort of the idea of differentiation and the fact that you don't want your show to be just like everybody else's show, but you also don't want your show to get stale. And so what I did in 2019 is I pivoted my format a little bit. I used to do 2 interview shows, Tuesday and Thursday. Now, this year, starting in January, my Tuesday show is just me. Now, last week I did an interview on Tuesday because I wanted to fit it in, and I had somebody staying at my house that I thought would be a good interview. But most of the Tuesday shows are me talking. And the reason I did this is another podcaster I know, all of a sudden, he's all over the business news. He's all over. He'd been doing his show for about 3 years. It was once a week, and it was an interview. And a year ago, he added a second one, which was just him talking. And he said it changed everything for him because all of a sudden, he wasn't just the interviewer. He wasn't just Larry King.
Yeah.
He was actually an expert talking on business topics. And so I decided I was going to do the same thing. And as it turns out, a lot of people who listen to my show tell me they like the solo shows better, which was fascinating because I thought originally when I started the show, I thought, who would ever want to listen to me? I have to do an interview format. Well,
I mean, you're a keynote speaker. You have interesting things to say. I've seen you on stage, and I know that you have an interesting and unique insight to business topics, entrepreneurship, all of that. So I think people do want to hear you. And I think that that's what's interesting about podcasting is it does give you a level of instant credibility, right? How is that really dovetailed into your keynote speaking and other aspects of your business and really ultimately helping you become an influencer?
So I think we're caught up in this world where people want to see experts. So last year I added into my introduction, I mean, you've all been to conferences, so you know that when you go to a conference, the keynote speaker, if they're famous, maybe they have some big video that introduces them. I actually don't like that format. A lot of my peers, even non-famous ones, have these, like the host just says, roll the video. And it's like, da, da, da.
Right.
And, drone footage of New York City zooming into them having coffee and eating toast. I don't like that type of intro. I still am a little bit old school. I still like a basic short intro of who I am as a speaker coming from whoever the host of the show is.
Yep.
But I added into that intro that he's also the host of the popular Cool Things Entrepreneurs Do podcast with over 4.5 years and 400 and whatever we're at, 450 episodes. I will then speak about potential, or I will speak about how to get your team more engaged.
Yeah.
And at the end, people will line up with their phones in their hand and say, how do I find your podcast? What was it called? So people right now are really into the idea. And what I'm finding is that 4.5 years, 450 episodes is what's really grabbing people. People are telling me left and right, I can't believe you've done this many episodes. So they say that out there in the iTunes and other worlds, there's about 660,000 podcasts right now. As you said, half of them are dead.
Yep.
But the question I've been trying to find is how many of them have over 500 episodes, because I'm closing in on that number.
Yeah, certainly. And again, going back to your point number 4 about if you need to change it up, change it up. I think what the key is there is you also have to know who you're serving. Like, who is that audience? Who is that one person that if you could replicate him or her 100,000 times over, like, what does she want to hear? And not being afraid to ask, right?
And you don't want to bore her. That's why shaking it up a little bit. The adding the episode of just me allows me to do anything I want. I can do something a little more serious. I can do something a little more fun. I can go off on a tangent.
Yeah.
I can talk about whatever I want. And then the other part of that is it's the changing of it, the changing of the format. You start to see what people like. Like some people are like, I prefer the interviews. Some people are, I prefer the solo one.
Yeah.
So if you don't change it, you'd never have these conversations with your listeners. So I think sometimes, there's so many interview shows that I felt I just needed to sort of shake the pot and do something a little bit differently. And by being able, great entrepreneurs tell me all the time that you have to pivot. You can't just, if you keep doing the same stuff, you're going to get the same results. So for me, this pivot was really important. But here's the other thing, is when I interview you, my topic is around your expertise.
Yep.
So, and the page that's written on my website for the podcast is about that. However, when I pick a topic, I can deal with changing up the search engine optimization of what I'm going to talk about. So is there a hot business topic? And then after I do the episode, is there a way I can write the copy for the show notes that actually will work to being found? So a lot of my solo episodes, I'm using specific keywords that I want to be found for.
Yep.
And it's actually helping with my SEO a lot more than the show was before.
Are you using any sort of keyword search engines or tools like, Google Search Console or anything like that?
Yeah, I use Google Search Console, but I also use a tool called SEMrush.
Okay.
And it's not cheap, but it's really good at showing you what are terms around certain topics that people are searching for.
Yeah.
And then they have a template that helps you write, making sure you're using all the words in the article to help it be findable. And I'm not doing that for every episode, but I am doing it for the solo episodes where I'm talking about topics that tie directly into what I want to be found for in search.
Well, and I think that takes it to another level. And we're talking about podcasts that support an existing business. So we're not talking about a hobby podcast that's all about basket weaving or whatever, just for fun. I guess you could use strategy with those as well, but we're talking about a podcast that you've launched that's specifically supporting your business. I see a lot of wisdom in that because I would imagine, Thom, you don't speak about all topics on stage. What are your key topics that you like to speak about and what people hire you to speak on?
Right. Well, I have 2 topics. I started speaking about how do you engage more in a world where everybody's on their phone. So the title of the keynote has sort of morphed over the years, but it's connecting with people in a gadget crazy world. And over the last decade that I've been a professional speaker, we've seen more and more connection to our smartphones and less looking up and talking to the people next to you. A month or so ago in Austin, Texas, where I live, was the South by Southwest Festival, which has become huge. It just keeps getting bigger. And I would walk along, like there'd be lines to get into things. There would be 500 people in line, and I would walk by these lines and look, and not a single person, even if they're with their friends, was talking to anybody. They're all staring down. I posted a picture of that, and my chiropractor said, "Keep it up. This is what keeps me in business. People are having more neck problems than at any time in history."
That is brilliant.
Position is down looking at our phone.
Right.
So, and then I went into a session, and I sat next to this young woman. She was about 30, and she put her phone down for a split second. And so I said to her, "Are you enjoying South by Southwest?" And we ended up talking for the whole 15 minutes before the speaker started. Yeah. And I said to her, and she was a millennial, and she said, we were talking about this topic. And she said, "Yeah, I don't like, talking to people." I said, "Well, did you not like talking to me?" She goes, "But you instigated." And So it was like she would never have instigated a conversation with the person next to her. But 10 years ago, when you went to a conference, you didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
There was nothing to do but sit there. So you eventually said, so you enjoying the conference, or where are you from?
Yeah.
And so that's what I teach, is how do we get back to human engagement? And then I also have a program called the Paradox of Potential, because here's the deal. We get so excited when someone has potential on our team, but potential doesn't equal performance. It doesn't equal results. And so I have a program where I speak to companies about that gap between potential and performance, and how do we help move everybody across it. But that's not what my podcast is about.
But I think they dovetail into the topics and the guests that you bring on. So I think having that strategic mind of like, these are the core things that I want to be known for, my brand, whatever line of work, regardless of if you're a public speaker or not listening to this episode, what do you want your brand to be known for? What are your core messages? And then thinking about how do your podcast support that? And I think that goes back to what you're talking about of really choosing keywords, hot topics that people are talking about that your audience is trying to figure out and grapple, and then record and create content that supports that.
And always be willing, like I said, to pivot, to change it up. And even in the middle of an episode, sometimes when I'm interviewing people, if I don't feel it's right, I change and go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Like you said, it is a conversation.
Yeah.
But too often people do shows and they are too scripted, and I don't stick with those shows very long.
Tom, how are we doing today? Are we okay? We're having a good conversation?
You're doing a great job.
Thanks. All right. So tip number 5, what's your last lesson learned over 450 episodes?
So if you're listening to this and you're like, oh, I've been thinking for 5 years about starting a podcast, Tom is an inspiration. He's changed my life. I'm going to take the action. For God's sake, don't do it all alone. Hire a production company, unless you are already like some wizard at editing audio. Because I will tell you, people say, where do you get the time? Well, my show's about a half hour. It often runs long because I'm a talker. So maybe it's 40 minutes. I do about a half hour of show prep before a guest. So we're looking at about an hour and 10 minutes. As soon as it's done, I just load it to Dropbox and I don't think of it again. I just load, I load up the show notes. So I'm into about an hour and 15 minutes an episode.
Yep.
And then I have a production company who goes through and makes the edits. If somebody has a coughing fit, they can chop it out. If Skype goes down, they can fix it. Whatever it is, I have a production company that does it. And it's not cheap, but my show would never exist if it wasn't. I work with a company called Podfly. They actually sponsor my show. It's podfly.net/cool things.
Yep.
And they give a discount to people who listen to my show. And I would never, ever, 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 ever have 450 episodes if I hadn't partnered with Podfly.
100% agree. You could go ahead and just drop the mic right now, because I'm a firm believer as that as well. So in my past life, in my early 20s to mid 30s, I worked in commercial radio. I know my way around an audio editing board. I know how to do the editing, but I also know one thing is true about me, is that I would fiddle with it until the day the cows come home, and nothing would get released. So you got to outsource that. You have to have a podcast editor, and I dare say a show notes editor at the very least, especially if you're running a business all on the other side of it. It's a lot of work.
So I'll be real honest. I actually don't produce really detailed show notes, or I would pay somebody.
Yeah.
But early on, I was at sort of my budget cap when I bought equipment and I was paying Podfly. I was at my budget that I had set. And so what I do is I take the person's bio, and then I add like a sentence just to sort of introduce the show. And somebody said, Tom, why don't you do like detailed show notes? Like, click here, here's this, here's what they said at 3 minutes. And I said, as soon as a listener, or more than one, as soon as listeners ask for show notes, I will produce show notes. In 450 episodes, not a single person has said, why don't you do detailed show notes? So I've never done it.
Oh, Tom, this is such a hot topic in my office right now. We were just having this conversation at our team retreat last weekend about this. And here's what we've come up with. We've done some market research. We talked to about 80 of our listeners. And it's interesting in that 45% of our listeners listen to the podcast on the go, and they don't actually ever look at the show notes because they're on the go. They're on, the treadmill. They're on the school run. And then they forget to go click on it later. But there is a big faction of people also, I want to say it was like close to about 30% that they're like, yes, we go to the show notes all the time. So just keep that in mind, is that because they're not asking for it doesn't mean that they don't want it. And, we see the click-through rates on our Google Analytics.
You might be right, and you might have different listeners.
True. That's true. Our audience is probably slightly different from yours.
I've asked people, and people are like, yeah, I listen to you on iTunes when I'm at the gym.
Yeah.
I've never had anybody say that anything. Now, I probably haven't asked that detailed, but the truth is I keep my ear when I talk to people. I like to know, how'd you find the show?
Yep.
By the way, the number one way people find my show, someone told them about it.
Yeah. And which makes it such a great networking tool right then and there. Yeah.
I have to add something. You just said networking tool. So as I said, my original speech was about networking. It's about connecting with people in a gadget crazy world. I've been teaching this for over a decade. Several of my books are about networking.
Yep.
I have never found a better networking tool than my podcast, because I can call someone up and say, hey, I'd like to interview you. Almost everybody says yes. Occasionally people say no. It's not their thing, or the celebrities often say no because, they just want other celebrities to interview them.
Tom, you keep at it. Be persistent. You never know. All right. So I want to touch on a couple more questions before we wrap up. Now, we talked about this idea of like, okay, wow, that's a lot of information, Tom, and that sounds like a lot of work, and I don't know if I'm ready to launch my own podcast, but I want to be booked onto other podcasts. What do you suggest, or how does one get booked onto other podcasts as a special guest? Like any best practices that you would suggest?
It's getting harder and harder and harder because traditional PR people have jumped on the bandwagon of getting their people on podcasts. Mm-hmm. And I make a lot of enemies with traditional PR people because I don't care that you represent someone who is smart or has done something cool. I have a lot of friends, and I meet a lot of clients and people who are smart and have done something cool. Yep. And I'm only looking for one interview a week now.
Yeah.
So I'm looking for something very specific. And yet I get approximately at least 10 emails a week from people pitching to be on my show.
Yep.
And it always starts off with like some phony thing of, oh, I'm a big fan of your show. BS, you're a big fan of my show. They always come back and say, I loved the episode with, and it's like the latest episode.
Yes.
It's like all you did was look at my show and pull that person's name off of the show note page.
Yep.
So here's the thing, is that if you want to be on someone's show, go promote their show. Listen to their show and promote their show, and make sure that you're a guest. If they interview celebrities and you're not a celebrity, don't pitch them. Mm-hmm. But if you're an accountant and it's the Accountants Today podcast and they interview regular old accountants, listen to the show, put it on your social media, let people know, because if somebody puts it on LinkedIn, which is where my clients are, mm-hmm. 3 or 4 times over 3 or 4 months and just says, oh, I love this show. And then they come back and say, I'd like to be a guest. There's a pretty good shot if somebody has promoted the crap out of my show.
Yeah.
They're be on my radar.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if they're tagging you, then the notifications popping up on your social media accounts as well. I think that's a great bit of advice. And sometimes we forget that. We think about our own goals, initiatives, and all the things. We think about us first, right?
I told a PR person, if they promote my show a little bit, I'll talk to you.
Yeah.
And she goes, that's not the way this works. They're on your show to get. And I said, well, no. I need a partnership.
Yeah. Well, and that's where the smart people that are getting booked onto podcasts, and we're not talking the mega huge ones, though, there's tons of us that are, working with our 1,000 true fans, right? Just like you and me, that absolutely, when you lead with giving first, when you start that conversation by connecting with them in social media.
If you referred me to speak at like a 1,000-person conference, mm-hmm. whether I got it or not, if I ended up in the finalists,
yep.
And you referred me and then you said, I'd love to be on your show, I don't care if you make toenail clippers. We'll put you on the show.
Yeah.
If you're really giving first of something of value that matters to me, then they're going to be on my radar. I speak a lot about mentorship, and I have 2 gentlemen who I mentor. And back at South by Southwest, we did a panel on, mm-hmm. How do you find and get a mentor? One of the 2 guys who are my mentees, they're like my fake sons. We're so close now. And their friends are always like, how do you get a mentor who's so engaged in your life? Well, one of them saw me speak as a college student and decided I had to speak at his college. but his college wouldn't give him enough money to meet my fee. He went out and raised the money. He was a commercial real estate major. He went and got 4 commercial real estate companies to give him several $100s each to make up the delta from what the dean would give him.
Yep.
And he brought me to speak at his college. Do you think he was on my radar screen when he moved to Austin 2 years later? He's like, do you remember me? Of course I remember him. He goes, can I buy you coffee? Of course you can. And then our relationship has grown to the fact that, he's like my extra kid.
Yeah, it's interesting. We just spoke to author John Ruhlin. He wrote the book Giftology recently, and he was talking about the same exact thing. It's like when you're wanting to make an impact with other people that you're hoping to build a relationship with, you start by giving first. You start that relation not asking for what you can give me, but what you can give them. And it is same. It's a long tail strategy. So what
Gain Get is a speech that I'm going to be doing for a company coming up here soon. And the company sort of came up with the title of that speech, but I don't have to do any rewriting because it's what I really believe is that you got to give first if you're going to gain and get.
Yeah. And for me, what I do is, I'm a podcaster. I have my own show, but I certainly want to be on other podcasts out there in the world that are aligned with our same audience and vision. So, I create a list. I create a dream list of, say 20 or 30 podcasts that I want to be on as well, and start nurturing that relationship through social media, through LinkedIn, through other various options. And again, same, talk about them, promote them, and my marketing efforts above and beyond. And I'm not expecting a yes right at day one. I'm actually looking for the yes 3-6 months down the line. So, on the most rudimental terms of what we're talking about here, create a Google spreadsheet. Put some names in there, last date of communication, next task that or next touch point that you're going to have with them, and track it. And you will see success after time. So, Thom, once booked on as a special guest on somebody else's podcast, what would you suggest are 1 or 2 tips that they can do to be a great guest on air?
Listen to the show. Listen to more than one episode. Listen to 3 or 4 episodes. If you're going to be on my show, listen to the interview episode so that you kind of know where we're going.
Yep.
And then the second thing is, I go back to what I said before, promote their show. A lot of people say, oh, I'll promote the heck of it after I'm on it. And then I barely get a retweet because people move on to something else.
Yep.
So, in the week leading up to it, go onto your Twitter account or your Instagram account or your Facebook or LinkedIn account and say, oh my gosh, this week I'm going to be on this great podcast, blah, 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 blah. I don't know when it's going to air, but I'll be sure to tell you, check out the show. The guest, the host, will love you so much when you come onto his show or her show that it'll change the interview.
Yep.
Very few people do that.
So here's the secret for that works for our team is if you use any sort of scheduler for your social media, like Hootsuite or TweetDeck or things like that, and you know that this episode's being released, say, I don't know, September 1st, then you can put the links into your Hootsuite and, pre-schedule 20 different tweets that go out for the 3 months after that. So it's not just talking about it when the episode releases, but also it's already built in. You're not even thinking about it. It's clockwork. The tools are working in your favor so that is tweeting out and linking back to the original podcaster. And you know what's going to happen? They're going to retweet it. And then that's where things grow and expand from there. So, okay, Thom, let's wrap up. First and foremost, people can find you online at thomsinger.com. That's a TH on the Thom part. And where do you hang out the most online? Twitter?
So probably LinkedIn.
Okay, yeah.
And then Instagram.
Okay.
Probably 2 places where you'll see the most activity.
Great. So on Instagram, it's Thom Singer. Again, that's THOM Singer. And then on Twitter,
Thom Singer. And then also I have the @Cool Podcast.
Yep, got it. So we'll have the links to the show notes for those so you guys can connect with Thom there as well. So a couple of questions that I like to ask every guest. And again, thank you so much. I really want to acknowledge you. 450 episodes is no small feat. You have done great work. You have had really incredible guests on that are, not mega huge people necessarily that have been the most inspiring for me, but the ones that are powerful are the ones where I have ahas and I can take action immediately. So keep going. You're on the right track. So, Thom, tell us, what's one book or blog that you're reading these days that is either inspiring you or maybe poking holes and challenging you a bit?
So I'm currently reading a book called Limitless by a woman, Laura Gassner-Otting, and I met her at South by Southwest. She's a speaker. I knew of her online, but we actually got to go to dinner with a big group of people, a bunch of speakers who were all speaking at South by Southwest, who are part of this like super secret speaker Facebook group.
Cool.
Several of us went out to dinner one night, and she's just delightful. And basically, her book is all about the title of the book is Limitless. I think it sort of gives it away. It's how do you go beyond? So the subtitle is How to Ignore Everybody, Carve Your Own Path, and Live Your Best Life. So I think that it is an amazing book, and she herself is amazing. She was a recruiter for years, so she got to see a whole bunch of people, were able to make big job changes at these high executive levels. Through that, she had learned so much.
Yeah, she sounds amazing. We'll definitely put a link in the show notes. In addition to that, tell us who's one person that you know out there that's doing amazing things in their little pocket of the world. Somebody that you think we should interview on the Simplifiers podcast, and why?
God, this is such a hard thing to say because I know so many people. I mean, I could fill your calendar for the Simplifiers for the next 6 years.
Yeah.
But the person who comes to mind is a person who's a personal friend of mine. She also holds the record. She has the red jacket for having been on cool things entrepreneurs do more than anybody else. And that is a woman named Jessica Pettit. And that's Pettitt. I always joke that she has way too many T's in her name.
Yeah.
But Jessica is an expert in inclusion, diversity, trans issues, and in just how do we deal in a world where people look different and people are different and they have different backgrounds and different beliefs. How do we all get along? And her book is called Good Enough Now, which basically is a message to all of us that we don't have to be perfect. Go start it. Go do it. Go get along with the person in the next cubicle, even if it's scary. And she's an amazing person, and she will talk to you about topics that maybe you're not used to hearing, which so I think she would be a great guest.
Jessica sounds incredibly intriguing. I definitely want more information about her.
And also, and I know it's audio, but she has like amazing tattoos and really purple hair.
I love it. Even better. So tell us, let me just say this. Gratitude and simplicity, in my book, go hand in hand. What is one thing that you're grateful for right now in your life?
I'm grateful for my family. I have great kids. My kids are kick-ass, and I know every parent thinks that, but my 17-year-old said to me recently, "You and Mom are so lucky." And I'm like, "Why are we so lucky?" And she goes, "Because my sister and I are good kids." And I laughed. I said, "Yes, that had nothing to do with parenting, I'm sure. But we are lucky. They are really good kids. They make smart choices for the most part. I have a 17-year-old high school junior and a 22-year-old college senior. And they're just really good kids. So every day I look at them, or I don't see the 22-year-old every day. She lives in Pittsburgh. But I think of them, and I realize that the gratitude that my wife and I have is a 10 out of 10.
And again, if you are inspired by today's episode, I highly recommend going back to Thom's website, Thom Singer. If you're looking for resources on how to build influence, unlock your potential, and truly drive performance, this is where it's at. So Thom, my final question for you today is this. Someone somewhere has been listening to this episode and she's super inspired. She's thinking, "Oh, maybe this is the time for me to launch a podcast. Maybe this is the right next step in my business." What's one thing that you could whisper into her ear right now just to encourage her?
So this doesn't directly fit with the question, but I'll bring it back around. And that is something my dad always said to me. And that was, be slow to anger and fast to forgive. So that's always the advice that I give when people ask me for, what's a piece of advice you have. So often we get so mad, we point fingers, we blame other people, and it paralyzes us.
Yeah.
Truth is, the other person probably wasn't out to slight us. They just did. They were doing their own stuff. So forgive people, be fast to forgive people, and get slow to get angry, and then couple that into the Nike theory of just do it. So get out there and don't blame the past. Don't blame other people. If you're inspired to start your podcast, Go start your podcast, interview somebody.
Take action, make it happen. Thom, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.